Chapter 5 Palace Tour. Dane? Alana came over to check her pulse. I'm fine, just dizzy. She closed her eyes and took a few deep breaths, then sat up. From some pocket, Numer had produced his vial of wake flower, a scent guaranteed to revive the dead. Just the threat of having to smell it cleared her mind. The vulture flapped awkwardly across the room, clutching the wooden screen over the window. He pecked at the openings in the window. 6 feet in wingspan, he made the room much smaller. Is your weakness part of this new working? Asked Numer. I don't know. The times it happened before, the tiger rug in my room, and a 3-horned skeleton in the Hall of Bones, it was just a flash. They didn't move about for long. I need to sit, Alana said, and did. What'd you say? Tiger and the 3-horn? Did you bring them to life on purpose? No, it was an accident. The vulture hopped onto the bed and leaned against Dane. That may explain why you're weak. This time you tried to do it. The champion looked at Numer. Do you agree? The mage tugged his long nose. Dane braced herself. That tug always came before a flood of learning. To reason without information is fruitless. To acquire more information, Dane must conduct further experiments. Numer rubbed his temples. What precisely did the badger say? She repeated it as closely as she could remember. The tiger and 3-horn. What happened? He paced as she explained, the vulture watching him with interest. You are sure neither the slave in your room nor Lyndall saw anything? No, I don't think they could have covered up if they saw. Alana laughed shakily. Nor could I. Dane tickled the bird's foot and he nibbled her hair. I can't talk with him. It's like he's got no mind. But he mustn't he? He looks like he can think. The timing is inconvenient, Numer said, toying with his black opal pendant. We can't investigate properly while we are here. I will say this much. What you have done sounds like no wild magic I have ever heard. Only the gods can bring the dead back to even a seeming of life. I'm no god, protested Dane. What if the badger passed some of his godness on to me? The mage shook his head. There is nothing in the writings about animal gods to indicate they are able to do such a transfer. Not only that, but normally their power only affects those of their own species. The badger's magic should apply to badgers alone, as the wolf god applies only to wolves, and so on. Only the great gods have power that translates across species. Mithros, the goddess, the black god, the graveyard hag, the master of dream, Ganiel. Don't name them all, Alana said, too patiently. Numer smiled. No, of course not. In the meantime, Dane, I think it would be best if you said nothing of this, and, in particular, did nothing with it until we got home. I'll try. It keeps getting away from me, though. What about him? Asked the champion, pointing to the vulture. We can't just let him run around in here. He's losing feathers, for one thing. It was true. The bird's movements had shaken a number of small feathers from their moorings. Dane asked, What do you want to do, wing brother? The vulture hopped from the bed, landing on the deep windowsill. Keeping his balance with the help of his wings, he pecked at the cedar screen. You want out? Taking him out now is tough, Alana remarked. People will ask questions. I assume you want this kept quiet. As quiet as possible, Numer said. You don't know Ozorn. If he found out she could do this, you don't ever want him to find out. Dane said nothing. After what she had seen that morning, she planned to give Ozorn as wide a berth as possible. Something about the way he'd made the image scream without let-up had chilled her to the bone. To the vulture she said, If I take you to my rooms, will you stay there and pretend to be stuffed if the servants come in? When it's dark, we'll go outside. The vulture nodded. Numer reached into his belt pouch and produced a round stone. This cat's eye gate will make you two invisible once the spell is activated. When you're in your room, put it in your pocket. Out of the light, the charm will end. Don't bump into anyone, or they will see you, spell or no. Come on, Dane told the vulture. You'd best walk. You're too big to carry. The bird hopped to the floor, wings half opened for balance. Numer made a sign over the cat's eye, then gave it to Dane. Without looking at her tall friend, she said quietly, Numer, you shouldn't have tried to hit him. I don't think he liked it. Quickly, before he could answer, she left, the vulture hopping beside her. Kitten dropped a pawful of ribbons and screeched when Dane walked into her room. Zack, absorbed in the paint pots on the dressing table, didn't see Dane and her companion until the girl put the invisibility stone away. The vulture looked at him, and Zack chattered unhappily. He's all right. Dane assured the marmoset. He's dead. He won't hurt you. Did you do the thing to him you did with the tiger and the big skeleton? Zek asked. Yes. Seemingly, if I do it a purpose, it lasts longer. The vulture hopped onto her desk and folded his wings. Tonight I'll take you out and put you where you won't be found, she told him. And you two, leave all this alone, she scolded Zek and Kitten, seeing the mess on the dressing table. Pick those things up, Kit. Replacing tops on the jar, she noticed her hair in the mirror. Goddess! Sitting, she grabbed the brush and attacked her curls. Looks like birds nested in it. Someone tapped on the door. Come in. Alana entered, smiling when she saw Dane in front of the mirror. Then, looking at each corner of the suite of rooms, she flicked her fingers, sending balls of purple fire into them. Once they reached their destinations, they stretched, lengthened, and turned into sheets of purple light that covered the door and windows. Coming to Dane, she took a ribbon from Kitten and began to thread it through the girl's hair. Dane looked at her in the mirror. Why'd you ward the room? Are we talking secrets now? Who did Numor try to hit? Dane related what she had seen. When she was done, Alana cursed under her breath. You're right to be upset. I can't believe he was so foolish. He gets fair protective of me sometimes. He also as much as told the Emperor you're his weak spot. Dane nodded. I don't think Osborn would endanger these talks, but there is life after them to be considered. When we go home, it will be hard to stop Osborn's spies from trying to hurt either of you. Men, why can't they just keep quiet about things? Outside, a gong sounded the call to the talks. Alana sighed. I have to go. Be careful in what you say to the prince. Remember, he is the Emperor's heir. I'm hardly likely to forget as much jewelry as he wears, Dane said dryly. Alana grinned. Be polite, and if you see Numor about to do anything else stupid, try to stop him. Kitten shouted agreement. Dane nodded. Believe me, I will. Alana clapped her on the shoulder and left. The girl looked at the vulture. Are you still awake? Its great wings spread and folded again. All right, remember what I said. The bird's feathers ruffled, then went smooth as another hand rapped on the door. Excuse me, Lady Dane? It's Prince Kadar. And here we go, she told Kitten and Zek, lifting the marmoset onto her shoulder. Kitten raced ahead and opened the door. Kadar blinked when he saw her companions. Won't they be happier inside? No, they would not, thank you. Kitten's a smart creature. If you don't give her new things to do and see, she finds them. Like a puppy in my new slippers? He inquired. Like a bear cub in your wardrobe, only bear cubs don't have magic. She does. She can whistle locks off doors, among other things. Very well, you would know best, of course. Since we're touring the palace, is there any area in particular that you would like to see? She took a breath. Actually, I'd like to look at chapels and temples and such. Have you any here? Until that moment, she had forgotten the old slave woman had suggested it. I'd like to have a nice long talk with her next time I see her, she thought grimly. Kadar frowned. Well, yes, but they're nothing special. You'll probably have finer ones at home. Except for the Temple of Mithros in Carthage City. It's very beautiful. If it's all the same, I'd like to see your temples here, please. His reluctance hardened her resolve. She smiled up at him. I'm making a study of them, you see. It was the right argument to employ with a young man who attended the Imperial University. Very well, though I still think you'll be disappointed. It's also a bit of a walk. When he offered his arm, Dane put Zek there instead of hanging on to it as he seemed to expect. He laughed and let Zek climb to his shoulder, then set off through the gardens. Dane walked beside him, looking at him sidelong. He looked different from the time she'd seen him before. He still wore his ruby drop and the ruby nose button, but had switched his other earrings to small hoops. He wore only a single heavy silver bracelet and no rings, boots, a white shirt, and loose maroon breeches. An open collar revealed a muscular chest, and his dark hands were large and strong-looking. Are you related to the Emperor on your mother's side or your father's? She asked, curious. Kadar, grinning as Zek inspected the gold rings in his left ear, asked, What? She repeated the question. My mother, Princess Fazia, is my uncle's sister. My father was a prince of the Chilogu province in Zalara, far to the south. As you can see, his teeth flashed in a broad grin. My father was much darker than my mother. Forgive me for asking, but you said he was? 5 years ago he was killed, putting down a rebellion in Siraj. What in Mithros' name is going on here? They had turned onto a broad walk lined with trees. Coming toward them was a squad of 5 soldiers marching in order, armed with spears and small round shields. Instead of armor, they wore gilded breastplates over knee-length scarlet tunics. The emblem on shields and breastplates alike was part of the imperial seal of Karthik, a crown wrapped in a jagged circle. "What's the matter?" she asked. "They're members of the Red Legion, soldiers, and they're here. The army isn't allowed on palace grounds, ever. Will you excuse me for a moment? I must speak with these men." Dane took Zek back from him. "Go ahead." He left briskly, seeming to grow an inch or two in authority as he advanced on the soldiers. They bowed deeply in unison, right hands placed on their hearts. When he spoke to them, Dane could see he addressed them as a prince, not as a teenager, and their leader spoke to him with respect. She wondered if she ought to improve her hearing to eavesdrop, and decided against it. Instead, she looked around, wondering where she was. To her left, on the far side of a bed of late roses, she saw an arch that led to an enclosed garden. At its center was a fountain, a tower of ornamental sculpture rising from a wide, deep bowl. On its rim sat the old slave woman. At least, Dane was fairly sure of the sitter's identity, but her appearance had changed again. The black stubble on her head was now at least an inch long. Parts of it were even longer and gray. Her gown reached to her calves. The leather sandals of last night had been changed for worn slippers with holes through which the lady's bunions protruded. A knobby walking stick leaned against the rim beside her. More startling than the change in her appearance was her company, a mass of black and brown rats. She was feeding them, at her feet, in her lap, and from her hands. Frowning, Dane headed for the fountain. Whatever was going on here, she wanted to know what it was. No more hints. Kitten squawked a demand, and the old woman looked up. One of her wicked black eyes was gone. A mass of old scar tissue filled the socket. The other eye danced at the sight of Dane as its owner grinned and waved. The rats turned to stare at the girl, dragon, and marmoset. Dane stepped up her pace, only to find that no matter how fast she walked, the woman and courtyard moved away, keeping the same distance from her as they had been when she first saw them. Kitten stretched her long neck out and trilled, the sound harsh in Dane's ears. Undoubtedly it was a spell of some kind, but it had no effect on the gap between Dane and her quarry. When the girl halted to catch her breath, the receding courtyard picked up speed, getting smaller and smaller as it moved away. At last it vanished. "That was interesting," commented Zek. "Can you do that?" "No." Vexed, Dane put her hands on her hips. "Something funny is going on here." Kitten nodded in agreement, her eyes half silver, her scales pink with irritation. "Dane, what in the name of bright Mithros are you doing?" Kadar, panting, ran up to them. "Didn't you hear me call? You were supposed to stay where I left you." Her legs and feet suddenly felt odd, the muscles loose and trembling, as if she'd run or walked hard for a long time. She slumped onto a nearby bench and rubbed her aching calves. "But I just turned aside to look in the courtyard." "What courtyard?" "It was right off that walk where you left me." She looked around and gaped. The trees, the walk, the 5 soldiers, all had vanished. Instead, they were at the top of a long dusty street, with no courtyards or fountains in sight. Buildings, each with a statue over the door, lined the avenue. At its far end loomed a big temple-like structure with a golden dome. "Where are we?" "The sacred district." Kadar yanked out a handkerchief and wiped his sweaty face, patting carefully to avoid smearing the paint that lined his eyes. "And you couldn't have seen it from where we were, because it's a 1/4 mile away from there. You've been here before, haven't you?" She stared up at him. "Are you crazy? I've never been to Karthik in my life." The additional thought that she was starting to wish she hadn't come now, she kept to herself. "Nonsense. You walked as if you were born here, and you didn't stop for me. Don't you realize you can't run around here without an escort?" Dane blotted her own face on her sleeve. The direct sun was brutal without trees to shield them. "I didn't walk here. I saw the old slave woman by the fountain, and I was trying to reach her. Do you know who she is? An old woman about my height. I thought she was a slave. Yesterday she straightened my room." Kadar's eyebrows snapped together. "Why would I care about any slave, young or old?" Dane felt as if she'd been punched. She fiddled with the cuffs of her shirt and collected herself. At last she said quietly, "Because I thought you were a decent human being." Kadar scowled and walked away for a few paces, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, Dane told herself. It's plain the old woman isn't a slave. A slave wouldn't feed rats or dice with Rakash. And I'm sorry he's in a pet, but I did think maybe he cared more about other people than some of them that live here. None of the furred ones cared about no furs, what you call slaves, said Zeg. That is, they care about when they hit the slaves, and that's all. The slaves work and try not to make the furred ones notice them. When furred ones, owners, Dane told him silently to keep the prince from hearing, two-leggers with fur, with hair, who order slaves to do work, are the owners of the slaves. Like the monster boy owned me? Asked the marmoset. The girl petted him gently. It's much the same. Kadar had mastered himself. I'm sorry if I was rude, he said as he returned, his voice cold and clipped. You must understand, I'm responsible for you. If any harm came to you, my uncle would be displeased. And your old woman cannot be a slave. When palace slaves reach a certain age, they are given tasks better suited to them, in the weaving rooms or warehouses or nurseries. The slaves in the guest quarters and the imperial and nobles' quarters are young. Now, if you please, you asked to see our chapels. Kitten made an extremely rude noise. For a moment, Dane thought the prince would lose his temper again. He fought the urge and smiled at last. She knows what that sound means? She knows the meaning of every sound she makes. Dane tried on a smile of her own as she got to her feet. After hearing that the old weren't allowed to work where they would be seen by anyone important, she knew it wasn't a good smile, but Kadar accepted it. He guided her into the first of a series of small chapels. This was dedicated to a god of the inner desert, far to the south, and a statue made of red sandstone was placed over the altar. While statues and altars changed from building to building, certain things were the same everywhere. Dust lay in corners, and under what few benches or offering tables remained. Dane saw none of the things she expected to see: incense, flowers, candles, lamps. The air in these houses of worship was stale and unmoving. The dust in the shrine dedicated to the threefold goddess was so thick that Dane couldn't make out the details of the wall mosaics. There were exceptions to the lack of offerings. The trickster, god of thieves and players, presided over an altar where lay scattered playing cards and a few wilted bouquets of weeds. Several someones had left shells or bits of coral for the wave walker, but the gilt on the sea goddess's statue was peeling. Hidden behind the altar of Shaketh, goddess of seers, were a score of candle stubs and a battered lamp. For Ganiel, the master of dream, Kitten found 2 lavender-stuffed packets, too small to be called pillows, concealed under a bench. Are these less-known temples? Dane asked. Are there others, more popular ones? Kadar's smile was crooked. These are the only palace temples. The ones in the city are not in such bad shape as these. Only Mithros' temple, the one with the golden dome, had serving priests, a 3-man staff, explained Kadar, with 2 boys as acolytes. All of them came running to greet their guests by dropping to their knees and touching their heads to the ground, a gesture that made Dane uncomfortable. Priests of any god should only bow to other humans, not genuflect as the Carthagese expected their slaves to do. This temple was in better condition. Brightly polished sun discs caught outdoor light and reflected it into the sanctuary, but streaks of soot above wall brackets told her that light after sunset came not from lamps or candles, but inexpensive torches. She smelled incense burning, and freshly cut flowers lay on the large altar, but the priests were underfed. Once they'd looked around, Kadar led her toward the back of the temple, past the altar. Where are we going? She asked. Aren't we returning the way we came? There's one more, explained the prince. Mithros is the best known, and the king of the gods, but our empire had its own personal goddess. Uncle built her a temple behind Mithros' house so he could make offerings to her once he was finished with his duties as the Sun Lord's high priest. Passing through a small door, they entered a long open gallery. At its end was a door inlaid with a patter of black and scarlet dice. Statues of hyenas sat on either side of the portal. A group of 3 rats sat over it. Dane looked at those carvings for so long that Kadar had to reach back and pull her through the entrance. Inside, the air held a faint odor of perfumes, but the silver candlesticks and chalices on the altar were tarnished, and the floor was unswept. Behind the altar was the image of the temple's goddess, the most unusual statue Dane had ever seen. For one thing, hyenas and rats crouched at her feet, like pets. One hyena held a dice box in its jaws, while 2 rats offered a die, each to their mistress. Except for the threefold goddess in her third aspect of the hag, or crone, goddesses tend to be young or mature women. This one did not show wisdom or grace as statues of the aged goddess did. This hag was bent, leaning on a gnarled stick, grinning so widely that the onlooker could see that she had only a few teeth left. Her eyebrows were bushy, one of them was cut in two by the strip of an eye patch. Dane and Kitten stared at it gape-mouthed, while Zek chittered in shock. "What is it?" asked Kadar, bewildered. "Dane, what's the matter?" I think it is. I can't say for sure with her hood up and being stone, not colored like it." "What are you talking about?" Kadar demanded. "Her! It's—" She was about to say the slave when her throat closed off, and she half swallowed her tongue. She choked, then coughed until her eyes ran. "Are you all right?" The prince thumped her between the shoulder blades. "Would you like water or something else to drink?" Dane shook her head. "I'm fine," she gasped. "I was just gonna say, that statue—" Coughs erupted, tearing at her throat. Both her nose and eyes ran this time. Whenever she thought she was better, each time she tried to explain about the resemblance between the slave and the graveyard hag, she began to hack as if she had lung disease. The explosions didn't let up until Kadar took her outside into a garden. She sat on a bench and took deep breaths through her nose, while the prince went to find water for her. "I know what this is," Dane thought furiously, clenching her teeth to stop the explosions. "She thinks she can silence me this way. What I'm going to say to her the next time we meet." "Who are you talking to?" asked Zek, confused. "Her! That hag these southerners worship. I'm coughing because she doesn't want me telling Kadar she's been about." "Then don't say anything if she doesn't like it," Zek said. "Our gods, Trick and Preet, don't like us talking about them to outsiders." Dane blew her nose. "Trick and Preet?" "Trick is the first male of the pygmy marmosets," explained Zek. "Preet is his mate. They are very private gods." Dane ran a finger down the marmoset's vari-colored fur. "That I can believe," she told him, "but from all Numer has said, this is not a private goddess, and she cannot play with me. I don't know why she's here and showing herself to me, but she can either let me speak out, or leave me alone." "She doesn't only show herself to you," Zek pointed out. "She was talking to the big stinker, Rakash, and to the rats." Kitten, following the conversation, nodded vigorously. The girl scowled. They were right. Moreover, Rakash had acted like the old lady was someone important. "And he didn't tell me who she was," she remarked aloud, her voice a croak. "Maybe he couldn't, but why stop me from talking about her?" "What'd you say?" Kadar had returned. With him came a young slave bearing a tray, a pitcher, and 2 cups. "I thought grape juice might help." At his nod, the boy put the tray on a nearby bench and poured juice for both of them. Once he presented the cups to Dane and Kadar, the prince ordered, "Leave us, but don't forget to return and clean this up." "Thank you," Dane told the boy with a smile. He bowed deeply and retreated, still bowing. "Perhaps your body reacted to the incense or flowers in the temples," Kadar remarked when Dane emptied her cup. "My life is a misery with sneezes and coughing at haying time, and my mother cannot be near roses without her eyes watering." Dane knew her problem had a very different cause, but she appreciated his concern. "I feel better now, thank you," she told him, thinking that seemingly she'd go on feeling better if she didn't tell anyone their hag was out and about. "No doubt you're wondering about the temples." He didn't meet her eyes, but fiddled instead with his ruby drop earring. "Perhaps folk here keep shrines in their homes?" Kadar shook his head. "I wish I could explain. There is no good—" "Never mind." "What's the matter?" Dane asked. "Is something bothering you?" Kadar shook his head and put a finger to his lips. The girl frowned, not understanding. With a sigh, he reached up and tugged his ears. Pale green magical fire sparkled around his fingers. "Magic? Ears?" Dane thought, then remembered Duke Gareth's warnings. "There's no listening spells on us, your highness. Kitten wouldn't allow it." Kadar frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Kit?" The dragon voiced an ear-splitting whistle. Light flared from the rubies at Kadar's nose and ear, from the etched and heavy silver ring on his left wrist. "So the only magic is on the things that glowed. Is that so, Kit?" asked Dane. The dragon nodded. "Your jewels are magicked," the girl told Kadar. He covered his bracelet and the ruby drops with his hands. "Not by Uncle or his mages." "What are they for?" He looked at her, tugging the drop. "Kitten really knows if there's magic near?" Dane nodded. "If she feels it, she uses a sound to make it appear. unless it's invisibility or illusions, those she sees normally. She caught your uncle our first night here sneaking around the reception while he was invisible." Kadar took his hand from his bracelet. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked Kitten. "You'd have whatever you desire." "Do you know how valuable she is, Dane? A creature that can tell when a spell is in place? Our nobles would give you her weight in diamonds." "She's not for sale," replied Dane. "She's her own self and goes where she wants." Kadar sighed. "Oh well. Did you know rubies are protective stones?" Dane nodded. "Mine warned me from the sendings of lesser mages, though they may not work against a powerful one. The bracelet works on drugs and poison in my food. Even if I eat them, the magic turns them harmless. That one was so costly, my mother won't tell what she paid the Shusini mage who made it. I think she sold family heirlooms to pay for it, but I don't like to ask because it saved me 5 times. Dane shuddered. "What of the temples?" she asked, putting the subject of Kadar's close calls out of her mind for now. "You were going to say why they're so neglected." "My uncle decreed that, since the gods are eternal and his is not, the people should not spend their money on offerings, but on taxes. Anyone caught making an offering to a god is fined the cost of the item. The priests, all but 1 or 2, and those the oldest, have been put to work for the empire as clerks and overseers. City temples fare somewhat better than the ones here, but even they don't look their best anymore. On the other hand, the treasury is full. That's all my uncle cares about, more gold for weapons, and the armies, and mages." He seemed relieved to be able to criticize his uncle without fear of being overheard. They stood and followed a walk that led away from the hag's temple. "But people need to worship, don't they? If they haven't got someone to call on, someone bigger who helps them with their troubles, what can they hope for? All creatures need hope, two-leggers or beast people. My uncle says if they need to worship someone, they can worship him." Kadar's shoulders drooped. "He says that he can change or ruin their lives more quickly than gods bother to." The hair on the back of her neck stood up. "But that's fair crazy!" "You noticed." For a long time they walked in silence, Dane mulling over what she'd learned. They reached the gardens that supplied the kitchens with common herbs, part of the working areas behind the palace. "We have a choice from here," Kadar said. "We can turn south and visit things like the wood shops, forges, stables, kennels, and so on. If we turn north, we'll come to the training yards used by the nobles and the bodyguards. The war horses are stabled out that way. My friends should still be there, practicing their battle and hunting skills." She had made him take her to the chapels, knowing he didn't really want to go. "Why don't we see the training yards?" Shielding her eyes to look up at him, she was rewarded by his grin. As he led her down the small roads that marked this area into neat squares, she asked, "Why were you so upset by those soldiers before?" The worry and concern that had marked him behind the hag's temple returned to his face, and she almost wished she'd kept quiet. "It's a breach in custom," he explained, nodding to the group of hostlers who bowed to him as they led horses past. "Traditionally, the army is forbidden to come closer than a mile of the palace. The men said the orders came from my uncle, who commanded regular small patrols to the palace and gardens, starting last night." He shook his head. "Is that such a bad thing?" she wanted to know. "At home we have the King's Own, the Guard, and the Queen's Riders all quartered at the palace." "Tortle's armies have never had a habit of rebelling against its rulers. Ours do. Evidently my uncle—" He looked at Kitten. "No one's listening?" The dragon shook her head. "Thank you. My uncle doesn't think he needs to be wary of the army. He looks more at certain nobles who have protested the state of things in the Empire, and who live here. He should worry about the army. Too many officers come from conquered lands and have no reason to love any of us." At the archery butts they found a handful of males their own age, practicing with short, double-curved bows. They were laughing, well-groomed young men, their skin ranging from tan to brown to black. All were dressed simply in brown, knee-length tunics and leather sandals. Their rank and wealth showed only in their jewelry, earrings, nose rings, or nose buttons, and in the high quality of their weapons. When Dane stayed with the Queen's Riders, she took a daily turn shooting with them, or with the guardsmen, pages, and squires. Now her hands fairly itched to try that short, well-made bow, but she was too shy to ask. Instead she watched, leaning on the fence that separated yard from street, as the youths joked and pummeled Kadar. They didn't appear to be in awe of the heir, but treated him as an equal. For a moment she saw Kadar relax, becoming as carefree as any of them. The sight of his wide grin and dancing eyes told Dane how much on guard the prince acted with her. As she waited, Zek climbed onto the fence to observe. Kitten wriggled under the bottom rail and sat up to watch. It was the flash of the dragon's blue-gold scales that drew the attention of the young men. Kadar, recalled to his duties, introduced Dane to everyone. The foreign names and titles flew in and out of her ears. She hoped no one expected her to remember all this information, but nodded and smiled cautiously. She did not like the way they looked her over, bold eyes lingering on her face, her chest, and everything from the waist down. Of course, she thought, red-cheeked from embarrassment and irritation. They don't usually see women with no veils, and in breeches. Dane is from Tortle, Kadar said warningly, noticing the same thing that Dane had. She came with the peace delegation to care for my uncle's birds. I have birds, sweetling, teased one youth. Would you care for them if I asked you nicely? He barely flinched when Kadar jammed an elbow into his ribs. Tortle. That's where they have a female as king's champion, remarked another. Maybe Tortle men are easily beaten, said one. No Karthiki men are bested by a woman. Dane inspected her fingernails. Anger was a warm, comforting fizz under her cheekbones and along her spine, driving off the gloom she had felt since her visit to the chapels. And are you willing to bet on that? She asked gently. Bet that we could beat your lioness? Asked someone. Oh no, she's busy. I can't bother her to teach a lesson to boys. I'll beat you. At archery. They laughed, even Kadar, and her blush spread. Kin was muttering to herself, not at all happy with the way this talk was going. Sorry, Dane, said Kadar, but we have only men's bows. You couldn't draw one. Her blue-gray eyes glittered up at him. Oh? She let herself into the yard. You'd be surprised what I can do, she told the grinning young men. Have you longbows? The young nobles laughed or groaned. One of them teased, Oh, I'm scared. Careful, Kadar. She might be one of those queen's riders, the ones that let females join. Or so they say. I've never seen one of these rider maidens. Have you? Dane's smile was sweeter than ever. I work for the rider horse mistress. Trust me, there are females in the riders, and they work for a living. To Kadar she said patiently, A bow? The prince took her into a shed at the side of the yard. They will be too strong for you, he remarked as she checked the unstrung longbows placed in wooden racks on the wall. Much as she wanted to try the recurved bow they used, she felt she ought to stick to the weapon she knew best. I'll judge what's too strong for me, thank you. Running her fingers down 2 bow stabs, she shook her head. The next felt better, but when she lifted it down, she could tell that the balance was off. We assumed those tales of women fighting among the riders were only tales. No woman has ever asked to enter our armies. With you so open and welcoming of the idea, I'm not surprised. She found one that might suit her and examined it carefully, warming the stab in her hands as she checked the grain and texture. This will do. Have you strings? He stalked to a cabinet, reminding her of an offended cat, and opened a drawer to reveal coils of bowstring, each in oiled paper. She picked one out. Women aren't up to the discipline of military life. Looking over quivers full of arrows, she chose a handful. You must tell Lady Alana that sometime. I do it from a distance. I hope you lose, he muttered as she went outside. In the yard she backed up to the fence, since her bow had greater range than theirs. The targets were 18 inches across, with 2 rings and a bullseye, a difficult shot even for a good archer. The Karthikis watched as she stuck her arrows point first into the ground, keeping 2. These Kitten held as Dane looped the string around the foot of the bow and stood that end between her feet. She'll never bend that, she heard someone mutter. If only she had her own bow, the one that even the lioness had trouble bending. Holding the staff in one hand, the free end of her bow string in the other, she easily slid the loop over the top end of the bow. When she had taken her stance, left side toward the target, Kitten handed over the first arrow. Dane put it to the string, careful to keep the arrow pointed at the ground. Stand back or I'll hurt you, she warned her observers, then added, Tortle and the Queen's riders. She swung the bow up and loosed. Bow down, second arrow from Kitten, to the string, up and loose. The target was in her mind, not her eyes. She didn't have to take the time to aim that these males did. Now, pulling the arrows one by one from the ground, she fired until they were gone. Done, sweat gleaming on her forehead, she told the Karthikis, You may check my aim. At first nobody moved. Finally one of them went to look. Their judge carefully examined the arrows by eye and by touch, where they were clustered in the center target. At last he called, "We must cut them loose from the bullseye. They are too deeply embedded to be removed by hand." The young nobles crowded around her. She was incredible, they told her. Could all the Tortollan women shoot like that? When she mentioned she'd like to try the recurve bow, 6 of them were offered at once.